I'm Catherine. I'm the new moderator for the garden club here at the Eisenhower Library. Mics and cameras should be off for the program. This is a webinar format, but I will be monitoring the chat. So if you have any questions for the end, you can put them in the chat. And today we have Adrian Ayres Fisher. Adrian Ayres Fisher has been gardening with native plants for over 30 years. As programs co-chair of the West Cook Wild One, she educates about and advocates for native plant gardening, natural area restoration, and biodiversity. She also serves as volunteer steward of National Grove Forest Preserve in Riverside, Illinois. And her website is www.ecologicalgardening.net. Adrian, thank you so much for coming tonight. We're really excited to learn about everything you have to tell us about nature-friendly gardening. I'll let you take it away.
Okay, well, let me share my screen and sort of get myself going right now. And yeah, how's that? So, okay?
Yeah, looks good.
Yeah, so I am Adrian Ayres Fisher, and I should say that in addition to having gardened for 30 years, I have been a teacher. I've taught pretty much every level from preschool up through community college at different times in my life. And all along that time, I also was a gardener. I became a master gardener, and then I sort of dropped out of that because for various reasons, and then started volunteering for the forest preserves and took a lot of training. And now I am a volunteer steward, which means that I coordinate with the forest preserve. I run work days. I monitor plants and animals. I keep tabs on the place. It's sort of like day-to-day restoration management is what I do. And then the forest preserve provides, they have ecologists, they have maintenance people, they have the people that maintain the groves, they run the programs, all of this other stuff. But they really rely on us volunteers to do a lot of the work that helps keep the forest preserves high quality natural areas. Not every single one reaches that point, but it's a goal that they're always striving for. And then West Cook Wild Ones is a native plant gardening association that I encourage everyone to join. You don't have to live in Cook County, but we cover pretty much everywhere. I live in Oak Park. We go up to Evanston. We go into Chicago. We go down south. Anybody who has a love for native plant gardening or wants to learn about it is encouraged to join our community. And I'm going to start with a video. This is something I took in my backyard about 2 years ago. Those are Mexican sunflowers, which are one of my favorite pollinator plants. And I'm just going to start it. So here we go. It's a tiger swallowtail. Can everybody hear me okay? Okay, good. Okay, so I'm going to give an overview of how to garden for nature tonight. And I'm not going to get really deeply into the specifics because it can be a very involving and complicated subject. And I could do, or people who like me can do talks just about the plants, just about the birds, just about the butterflies, just about the bees. You know, there's all these subtopics that I'm folding in. What I'm trying to do tonight is just give an overview so that if you are a beginner, you can start to have a feel for what would be involved if you do want to invite more butterflies, more bees, and more birds to your yard. And there's actually three things that I'm going to talk about a little bit. The first one is attitude. If you decide that you want to invite more creatures into your yard and you want to think about gardening in terms of bees and butterflies, then your attitude is going to shift. You are shifting from what might be called an anthropocentric or human-centered attitude to a more holistic, nature-centered attitude. And then instead of gardening just for how something looks, or because you saw a magazine article that had everything lined up and very tidy and neat, you start to consider what the other creatures that you are sharing the space with, what do they need? Okay. So that's one thing, your attitude starts to change. Another thing that I'm going to talk about is the way that your gardening habits, if you really truly want to have comfortable and happy birds and bees and butterflies and other creatures, your gardening habits are going to change, and they're not going to be the same as might be recommended in popular gardening sites. And thirdly, I'm going to talk a little bit about the habitat needs of each type of organism. All right, so basically, like us, because they're all living organisms need shelter, food, and water. But their needs, their individual needs, might be a little different. So you can think of housing, supermarkets, good piped in water like we have, but then how are you going to provide it in your garden? The first thing to think about is the structure of the garden. And some of you might have tiny yards, and some people might have very large yards. But the first thing you want to think about, and even if you're just starting out fresh, I would say the first thing you need to do is plant a tree, because they take a long time to grow. And if you have the room, the first tree I would suggest that you plant is an oak tree, because they have the capability of supporting over 500 species of insects and caterpillars that birds who are having babies and need to feed their babies need to forage on. But I'll get more into that a little bit later. So then you have the tree, you have the canopy layer. And then below the tall trees, you have the subcanopy, or you could say the low tree layer. And those are understory trees. If you have a big tall tree, underneath it, you could plant like a pagoda dogwood, or you could plant a redbud or some other smaller tree. Under that, you want shrubs. Shrubs, native shrubs, are extremely important for birds, especially, and also butterflies, because some of their caterpillars use shrubs as host plants. And then finally, you have the ground layer, which is what they call the herbaceous layer, which is your flowers, your sedges, your grasses, all those little plants that kind of cover the ground and make the whole a good composition. Now, the thing is that if you have a tiny yard, my yard is not so big, and you might say, oh, this is like a really big place that you're seeing. Actually, it's like from a forest preserve. What am I going to do? Well, what you might do is think of one small tree and 2 shrubs and a garden with herbaceous plants. You don't have to do a whole estate size thing, but even that little bit would help. And if you have all you have is a townhouse, or if you have a balcony, you can do what you can do with you may not be able to have a tree, but you can have potted plants, and you can grow flowering plants in pots. And if they're the correct ones, they will still be useful to other organisms. My mom lived in the 5th floor of a condo near Lake Michigan, and she had a couple of big pots of flowers, and bees would actually make it all the way up to the 5th floor to visit her pots of flowers. So that's the first thing to think about. And if you want to go back out in your backyard or wherever it is your garden and think about that and look at what you've got and think, well, okay, I've got a tree, but I don't have any shrubs. Then you can think about, well, okay, a couple of smaller native shrubs would really improve the ecosystem in your garden. And that's really important. Okay. The other thing that's really needed is an open, sunny space full of mostly native flowers. Now, I say natives, partly because, yes, I belong to West Coast Wild Ones, which is a native plant landscaping association. But there are many ecological reasons for why native plants are preferable. The insects, the butterflies, the caterpillars that grow into butterflies, were evolved over thousands and thousands and even millions of years to feed on and live in the native plants that have existed in our region for that almost that long, since the glaciers receded. In fact, when the glaciers receded 10,000 years ago, a lot of the native plants that we see around today, when the forest preserves, rapidly moved into the area and had been there, because remember, the glaciers went to the middle of Illinois, and so south of that were all the native plants that had been there for millennia, and then they moved back up. And so when there have been scientific studies that show that bees, for example, and bees and butterflies are more abundant in places that feature native flowering plants and shrubs. Birds are more able to feed their young because, as I said, birds depend on insects, and the insects that are adapted to native plants are much more abundant. If you have a landscape that's full of calorie pair trees, you will not have the insects that the birds need to be able to reproduce, and so you have fewer birds. And so there's very good scientific reasons for using native plants as opposed to most of the horticultural plants that are from Europe or Asia that you see in places like big box stores. But I'll talk to that a little bit more later. What you want, if you have, and you can do this even if you have pots, or even if you just have a few square feet of garden, is 3-season bloom, because bees in particular have seasons. They come out early. There's some that nest in the midsummer, and then they are looking for plants in the late summer. Monarchs are when they start migrating in the fall, they need those late season asters and goldenrods. So getting bloom as long as you can is really important. Secondly, blocks or drifts of the same species. Like if you have a 3-foot block of purple coneflower, like is right here, that means that the bees and the butterflies can find those coneflowers more easily, and they can access them. And later, the goldfinches that love to eat the coneflower seeds will also be able to find them very easily. And so that's one thing. If you have a small place, try to pick a few species and have blocks of plants, because you'll still be, or drifts, as they say, you'll still be doing a lot of good. And then you want to have different species and colors and shapes of flowers. And you can see some of that in this picture. This is a design by a great designer on the East Coast called Larry Weiner, and he's written a couple of really good books about working with native plants. And the point is that different colors and shapes and sizes appeal to different species of bees and butterflies and even birds. Also, and I cannot say this strongly enough, light pollution is a hazard for all species, including us. It messes up our circadian rhythm. If the lights are on too late at night, if there's lights glaring into our windows when we're trying to sleep, it's not good for us. And it's really bad for wild animals and species, and particularly lightning bugs, fireflies. And this picture is, you can just see a little bit of a building over here. These people have turned off their backyard lights, and they have a big garden, and it's like a time lapse showing all of the firefly flashes. And you've heard that fireflies are declining. Well, one reason is light pollution, because when they're mating and they're flashing, their would-be mates, because of the light, can't find them. It drowns out the light. And so if you use dark sky approved exterior lighting, which is lights that are designed to only shine down instead of up into the sky or out, that helps. If you turn off backyard lights at night, if you put your safety lights on motion sensors, that all will help the creatures that you're setting up your little oasis for in your backyard. And finally, I just heard this from a firefly expert. I never thought of it, but if you plant trees and shrubs like your canopy layers, if you can place them so that they kind of shield the ground from the street lights, that also helps the fireflies and the other creatures that are trying to sleep at night. I mean, if you think about a mother bird and her babies, and then there they are out in this tree, and that helps protect, because the babies sleep at night too, and so do the parent birds. All right, then these more gardening habits, and I'm giving you a laundry list, but each of them is worth something. You want to add biodiversity in the ground layer, and what that means is instead of just planting one layer of vinca or pachysandra, try to mix species underneath your bush or under your shrub or your tree. This is my yard a few years ago. I've got Christmas ferns, I've got celandine poppy, I've got native regular violets, common violets. There's some, oh Lord, what else is in there? Oh, wild geranium. I've got quite a few things going on in here. And that helps it helps the roots go together and they meld together under the soil, and then that helps make the soil healthier, and then they also help different species of organisms that live among them. And I cannot stress how important it is to not use pesticides or fungicides. Pesticides being insecticides or herbicides. What insecticides do, particularly neonicotinoids or neonicotinoids, they are systemic insecticides. A lot of nurseries use them when they grow the plants, and what they're doing is producing toxic plants, because they are systemic and they poison every part of the plant. So if you're a bee collecting pollen from a plant that's been grown using those insecticides, you are getting poison pollen to take back to your nest. If you are a caterpillar eating a piece of leaf on one of those plants, you are eating poison leaves. And insecticides kill beneficial insects way more than they even kill the insects that are trying to be targeted. So as a home gardener, just don't use it. Just don't do it. What I found is I had an evolution back in the 90s or before. I was out there, I was spraying fungicides, I was worrying about insect pests, I was doing all of that. And then I had kids and I realized I didn't want to be spraying poison around them. And then for the forest preserves, I became a licensed pesticide applicator for the state of Illinois, because there are certain invasive plants like buckthorn that you can only use very limited amounts of a particular herbicide on. And so I had to get the license. And the more I learned about herbicides, the more I realized you don't have to use them at home. And the other thing that I learned, and insecticides also, the other thing that I learned is that the more varieties of native plants that you have in your yard, pests, like there's no pest problems. Aphids show up on my milkweed, and then pretty soon little parasitic wasps who are about the size of the aphids show up and take the aphids off to feed their babies. And it just goes like that. And so I can't remember I just don't use anything like that. I don't need to. So it's something to think and keep in mind is, do you want to have a healthy, thriving garden where you have all kinds of wildlife? Or do you want it to be a chemical preserve where you're pretty much interfering with the cycles of nature? And that's a choice that different people make in different ways. Messy gardening practices, that's like leaving the leaves, that's chopping and dropping, that's you don't have to put everything in your yard waste bags. And I'll talk a little bit more about that. But these are all things that help the living organisms, the non-human species, thrive in your backyard. particularly leaving the leaves. Remember, I was talking about fireflies a minute ago. Fireflies live among leaf litter. So if you're using, or your landscaper is using a leaf blower, you know how in spring people get out and they just blow all the leaves out from under the shrubs. Well, they're blowing out good fertilizer. Oh, that's another thing you don't need to use is fertilizer. And they're also killing fireflies because firefly larvae spend up to 2 years in the leaf layer, in the litter layer, the fallen leaves. And there's many other organisms that arthropods and decayers and animals that process the little, and when I say animals, I mean insects and other things like that, very tiny, that help recycle the leaves and free up nutrients that then go into the ground and then feed the trees and the shrubs. So leaf blowers, I don't like them because they're noisy, but I also feel that people don't understand how beneficial it is to just leave the leaves under the shrubs, under the trees, and let nature do what it does best. And if you do that, you'll be rewarded with many more fireflies and butterflies, because many butterflies overwinter either among the leaves or in the crevices of different plants of bark, or even hanging as chrysalises on dried stalks, dried stems that have gone dormant, and the stems have died, but then the chrysalises are there. And then in the spring, when they emerge as caterpillars, they climb down, emerge and climb down to the ground. So there's all kinds of reasons to take a less manicured approach if you are serious about wanting to have a wonderful wildlife garden. So also, if you're doing that, you are storing carbon. This is something all home gardeners can do, is sequester carbon. Great big chemical companies have not figured out how to pull the carbon out of the air, which would help with climate change. You, as a home gardener, have the power to do this just by planting plants and by adjusting your gardening practices. So plant your plants, don't dig too much. If you want to plant annuals, plant them in pots and plant perennials around. And here you can see in this picture on the left, you can see underneath a bush, actually it's a pagoda dogwood, so it's a small tree. A lot of, in the spring, you can see all the sticks that I've cut down, and there's leaf litter under there. And over here, you can see all the leaf litter. This is actually under a serviceberry, and you can see, and there's no mulch. I've used a layer of wood chips when I was putting plants in. And now I just pretty much the leaves, and if I cut down some stalks and cut them up and put them down in there, that works. And what happens is, as I was saying, all the roots grow together, and all the underground soil becomes full of organic matter, and it's like an ecosystem. It is an ecosystem under the ground. And if you are helping that, you are helping your plants. Your plants will thrive, and so will the birds and the bees and the butterfly. Another thing to talk about is your lawn. When I see a lawn that is, quote, pristine, unquote, and there's no clover, there's no creeping Charlie, there's no nothing, that is a lawn with problems, because I know that lawn has been drenched in chemicals that make it into a biological desert. Lawn does not store carbon as well as plants and shrubs and trees. It does not filter water, and a lot of us have water filtration issues, or we have water issues when we disconnect our gutters, and then the rain has to go somewhere, and lawn doesn't help it. And so a lot of people are, I don't know if you've heard of no mow May, a lot of people are taking an easier approach to mowing, especially in the spring. But it's also, for example, you can have a lawn that has clover in it. Clover and grass evolve together, and clover and grass benefit each other. Clover has deeper roots. It pulls more nutrients up from the soil, and the grass takes advantage of that. Clover fixes nitrogen so that the soil is more nutritious for the grass. It helps the grass get through dry periods. And so paradoxically, a lawn that has clover in it is actually a healthier lawn, and it will stay greener. Now in this lawn, they've got a few plantains, and I think they have some violets, and that's okay. Actually, it looks a lot like my lawn. And the creeping Charlie in a lawn is not all bad. This bumblebee is taking advantage of the nectar, because creeping Charlie blooms when a lot of other things are not blooming. And of course, our friend the robin, if a lot of fungicides and insecticides and pre-emergent fertilizer and weed killer is put on the grass, then it's harder for the robins to find the insects that they need in the lawn. So just a note about that. So there's a lot to think about. If you're going to be serious, or if you'd like to introduce gardening practices that will help the wildlife come to your lawn, it does require, as I said, a change in attitude and a change in gardening habits. But I believe that it's really, really rewarding. And I can stand in my yard, and my next door neighbor has a very conventional yard with maybe 3 species of plant, and it's grass and I think 2 shrubs. And I can see, if I'm on my back porch at night, I can see the fireflies outnumber the fireflies that are in their lawn. It's really remarkable. And I'm the one that has the cardinals and the robins and the woodpeckers and the hummingbirds in my yard, just because of the way I'm gardening. And my yard is not big. It's like 35 feet wide and 50 feet long. You know, it's not huge. All right, so now we're going to get to what individual kinds of wildlife need. Now, birds need places to nest. Birds will nest in trees, bushes, possibly birdhouses. They might try to nest next to your on your porch or something like that. But it's really, really good to have those resources. They need access to forage. They need seeds, berries, and insects. Now, a lot of native plants. This is actually a service berry, and in my yard, I have edible service berries. It's not a hybrid, and I love service berries. They taste better than blueberries, actually. And I have to kind of try to beat the robins and other birds to them because it's like a feast for the birds. They also goldfinches and other birds, they need some water. So and it doesn't have to be a fancy fountain, although they love running water. A water feature is always nice. I just have a plain old bird bath in my yard, and it works pretty well. And then places to go among on the ground, like cardinals. You think of cardinals as being tree birds, and you think of them as eating sunflower seeds from your feeder, which is certainly nice, but they feed their young insects, and they like to go hunting for insects in gardens. And so that's again another reason not to use insecticides, to let the leaf layer just lie there, because it gives good foraging for the birds that need it. And then the trees, chickadees, for example, eat caterpillars. They feed caterpillars to their young. And so you can see how if you don't have the trees that support the caterpillars, then the chickadees are going to have a really hard time. So again, food, water, and shelter. What do you need? It's just you have to think about what kinds of things do they want. I myself do not have a bird feeder. I have a hummingbird feeder. I make syrup for them every couple of days and put it out. But the hummingbirds come because I have red tubular flowers that they like. And we have Cooper's hawks in the neighborhood. So I don't have a bird feeder because Cooper's hawks will come and sit on a fence, and then they will hunt the birds that are at the feeder. It's like you've laid out a buffet for them. So I just, birds can can fend for themselves pretty well if you give them the correct kind of habitat. Native bees need, again, food, water, and shelter. They need places to nest. Now, native bees are, when most people think of bees, they think of honeybees. And when they think of honeybees, they're thinking of a particular species of bee that is not native and makes wonderful honey. I love honey. And lives in hives of even up to 50,000 individuals. Native bees there are bumblebees that live in small nests, maybe up to 200 individuals underground, like in an old mouse hole. And there are many, many species of native solitary bees that live in, they either live in the ground, they'll make holes in the ground and lay their eggs in the ground and plug them up. Bees are fascinating. I could just go on for hours about bees, but I won't. Or they might use old stems, as you see here. These are all places where bees have laid their eggs, and they will be plugging up the insides with a variety of materials, and then the eggs will hatch in the next spring. Bees need access to forage. They need flowers. This is a swamp rose in my backyard. Swamp roses give out pollen. Bees need pollen. That's how they get their protein and their fats. And that's what they feed their babies. And the swamp rose gives its pollen in the morning before 9 o'clock. So every morning before 9 o'clock, my swamp rose is covered with bees foraging for the pollen. And then about 9 o'clock, it stops. It's kind of fun to watch. The bush is right by my back porch, so I enjoy having my coffee and watching the bees forage. And then water, shallow and easily accessible. So you see, this is a nice picture because it's a log, and then it's just got some water on it, and it's very convenient for the bumblebee to just get what it needs without drowning. And you can duplicate that. You can put a stone in your bird bath, for example, or you can have just another place where you make sure that you have just a shallow area where they can get at water. And I'm going to show you a little video. This is a bee foraging. It's a Bombus bimaculatus foraging. And this is a plant called partridge pea, and I have a whole bunch of it growing in my yard because bees, remember I was saying a 3-foot block of flowers makes it really easy for bees to find it. And you can see how the bee doesn't go to every flower, and that's because they can tell which flowers don't have pollen or nectar and which do, or if other insects have followed them before, have been there before. And this is another plant that offers pollen in the morning, and it also offers nectar, but the bumblebees get the pollen, and the small solitary bees like the sweat bees, the halictids, go for the nectar that's actually not in the flowers, but it's in certain little glands down the stem and among the leaves. Whoops, sorry. Okay, so also the thing about flowers is that you want to have a variety of shapes. And I already talked about how 3-season bloom, but some bees have short tongues, and they like this is a black chokeberry. They like to be on flat flowers where they can easily get the nectar and the pollen. Other bees have long tongues, like this Bombus griseocollis, and they can get into tubular flowers. If you've ever seen a bee foraging in penstemon, for example, it's very cute because they just dig right all the way back down into the tube, and then their cute little bee bud is just kind of shaking out there. And then honeybees and other bees, like this is spiderwort. It's kind of a medium flower, and it appeals to all kinds of bees: long tongue, short tongue, medium tongue, honeybees, bumblebees. So it's good to have a lot of different kinds of flowers. And bee habitat is kind of similar to bird habitat. They also they want bare patches of ground because so many of the solitary bees, actually, you can't really see the holes, but there's holes in this picture in the ground. And in the spring, they emerge out of the holes and they mate and they start the cycle of digging a hole and laying their eggs and all over again. So it's a yearly thing. In undisturbed areas, this was taken in early spring. This is actually a patch of bee balm. And in early spring, I cut the canes, the old last year's stems, down to about 12 to 18 inches tall. And I just leave them. And the reason I leave them is because that summer, some bees will nest in the canes and then they will emerge next year. And the bee balm grows up all around it, so you don't even see that it's there. So you don't have to cut everything down to the ground. In fact, you shouldn't. You should just cut it about 12 inches tall and the plants will grow up around it. And then again, you can see how the ground around it, there's leaves, there's wood chips, there's, no, I do not even own a leaf blower. I would never rake this out. I just leave it pretty much the way it is. Bee blocks, I've never used them, but some people really swear by them. They're blocks where they have holes that are a good size for mason bees. And interestingly enough, piles of rocks or logs can be in good insect hotels, and bees will nest in among them. And so you want to have a variety. And of course, our friend the cardinal would also be very comfortable here, and the robin foraging around in here and looking for insects and seeing what they can find. Okay, so on to butterflies. Guess what? Butterflies need flowers too. There's a recurring motif here. Flowers, flowers, flowers. I cannot say it strongly enough. All of these creatures, one reason they are in decline is because they don't have enough habitat. And a huge part of habitat for bees and butterflies literally is flowers. So we like flowers, we're human, plant flowers. The more flowers you plant that are native flowers, native plants, the more bees and butterflies will benefit. Butterflies also need places to lay eggs, which means they need host plants. There are different species of butterfly need different host plants where they can lay their eggs, and the caterpillars can then feed once they hatch. And plants create defenses over millions of years. They have chemicals that they have in their leaves, in their stems. And over these millions of years, the butterflies and the caterpillars have evolved to be able to eat and digest plants that might be poisonous to other species. Milkweed is a perfect example of that. So actually they don't eat and digest the glycosides. What they do is they get the nutrition out of the plant. The glycosides, I think that's how you say it, it's the glycosides, they store and then they excrete them. So they don't even digest them. It just comes through their body. And so it's important. Caterpillars or butterflies use a lot of the native trees as host plants, like maples, for example. But they also use dill, they use certain shrubs like prairie willow. And it's hard to keep track of what host plants. So I just solved it by having a variety of shrubs. I know that in my yard, there's an oak tree and there's a pagoda dogwood, and there is a lot of milkweed. And so I'm doing the best I can. There's pellitory, because American ladies like pellitory. That's a kind of a weedy plant that I grow in the back of my beds. Butterflies also need water. It also needs to be shallow and easily accessible. The other thing butterflies like, weirdly, is overripe fruit. And I've seen that. I've put out overripe cherries before, or other kinds of things. And butterflies, just certain species of butterflies just really flock to them. And they like mud puddles. So you can take a shallow dish and put mud or sand or something in it and just keep it wet, and the butterflies will appreciate it. And also, like bees, they like warm places to sun on cool days. And so some flat rocks are very, very handy to have in the garden. And they need places to overwinter, which is, I've got the leaf litter down here. As I was saying, some caterpillars overwinter as caterpillars, kind of nestled into nooks and crannies in tree bark and places like that. Others just, they have disguised themselves so that they look like, they camouflage, they almost look like a stick. And so they'll just actually literally be on a stick or on a limb of a tree looking like another extra little stick. Others roll themselves up in leaves in the leaf litter, and then they emerge in the spring. Not all butterflies migrate south. And so that's another reason, leave the leaves, because you never know what's going to emerge out of them in the winter, in the spring. And I was talking about special host plants, and I'm just going to make a pitch for monarchs. Monarchs are, of course, our most charismatic butterfly. Everybody loves monarchs, and they need milkweed. That is the only thing that their caterpillars can eat. Luckily, we have a number of species of milkweed. Swamp milkweed people like to put in their gardens if they're not too dry. Regular milkweed can be kind of wild. I actually have a patch of milkweed that just appeared in my lawn, so I'm just letting it grow because that's fine with me, but some people might get upset by that. And then if you have dill, or if you have a plant called golden Alexanders, your black swallowtails are going to make good use of it. And it's always really fun to see black swallowtail caterpillars working their way down a big stalk of dill or some golden Alexanders. And then again, in the fall, monarchs, that last generation, they're going thousands of miles down to Mexico to overwinter, and they need asters, they need goldenrod to keep them going as they're going south. So it's important to think about that these creatures have lives that go beyond your yard, and or maybe they're migrating, just like birds are migrating in from the north or the south, depending on the season. And you might want to think about, okay, my yard is an oasis, it's a rest stop. What can I provide for them? This spring, last fall, I noticed the Swainson's thrush, which is a very shy and secretive forest bird that actually mates up in Canada. And it stopped in my yard on the way south. And I was like, oh my goodness, because nobody ever sees a Swainson's thrush. And, you don't see it very often. And then the remarkable, wonderful thing was that this spring, I heard the Swainson's thrush song, and it was singing from inside my pagoda dogwood where you couldn't see it, but it just had this beautiful song. And I was so excited because they remember location. And so if a place was good when they were migrating before, they'll come back, and that's where they'll go. Hummingbirds do that too. Okay, so this I'm just showing you. This is a very manicured yard, which is to a lot of people's taste. It's something that a lot of people aspire to have this very, very neat yard. And remember, as I said, we've got problems here. This grass is way too perfect. You've got what looks like maybe some impatiens in here, some annuals that are not doing anybody any good. And then over here, you've got, oh Lord, what do you have? Lamb's ear maybe, and some red petunias, and maybe here you've got some pachysandra or some vinca and non-native ornamental grasses. And I just want to point out, we have a lot of really great prairie grasses that you can use. You do not have to use grasses from China, just saying. So instead, that somebody, an actual person in Illinois, did this in their subdivision. And I don't know what the neighbors thought, but I think it's wonderful. And it is a different aesthetic. I will say it's quite a different aesthetic, and it might take some getting used to. But I bet that they have birds and butterflies and bees like nobody's business. And if you go for a wild look, it's easy to do it so that, like, if it's on your parkway, you don't put really, that's not where your 6-foot prairie plants are going to go. Okay. And that's where you might want to have a grassy edge so people know that it actually is a garden. And that's where you might want to have your sign. Like our wild ones, we have signs that advertise the fact that this is a wild ones garden. And other, like National Wildlife Federation has habitat signs and other things. So then people know that you're not just growing weeds, which is really important. And then again, in your backyard, this looks a little bit like how my brother's house used to look. And you've got, it's very neat. It's very tidy. It's what I call myself a mulch garden, because you've got plants decorating this nice big bed of mulch here. And again, this is a look that's pushed by landscapers. It's pushed by garden companies. It's pushed by all kinds of people as being a desirable look, but it's actually, it's designed, that kind of look is designed to sell a lot of stuff. You have to buy a lot of mulch. You have to use a lot of chemicals. Look at that pristine grass. You have to buy fertilizer. You have to buy, buy, and maintain. And it's sort of like, maybe you should put in plastic plants. I know I sound harsh, but it's like the older I get, the more determined I get that people should garden in a different way. Whoops. And then here, this is actually at the Chicago Botanic Garden, which is a place you can go for wonderful inspiration in how to do it. They have some beautiful native plant gardens. And this illustrates a lot of what I've been talking about, which is under a tree. You don't want just mulch. If you can do it, you have a variety of low growing native plants. This is a spring flowering garden. And in the summer, it just settles down and it's just nice green, like different shapes of leaves. And it's really pretty in the sun, in the summer, even when it's not blooming. And then they have a low little fence and they have a brick edge. So you know that this, even though it looks like you might think it's a mess because it's got about 10 or 20 different species of plant, and they're not all the same thing. So to some eyes, it might look really messy. You know that it's orderly because nature has a more complex order than we humans often think about. When we think of orderly, we think of things in rows, we think in things in 3s and 5s, we think in terms of squares and circles and things like that. And nature doesn't operate that way. Nature operates in patterns, in drifts, in complex interrelations of different species. And if you can sort of move into that kind of thinking, then this kind of garden is going to be more beautiful and seem more appropriate. Because it is working with nature instead of trying to impose our own idea of order on it. Even though, like I said, we've got the border, we've got a little fence. It's very clearly not a forest preserve. It's definitely a garden, and yet within it, there's room for all of these wonderful species that enrich our lives and also help the whole planet function better. So I think that's about it. I have one more thing to show you, and this is the hummingbird in my yard a couple of years ago. I planted cardinal creeper. It's like a little vine that looks a little bit like morning glories, but as I said, hummingbirds really like red tubular flowers. So I caught on my phone a hummingbird. And it's just really thrilling to see that. It just grew up among the ivy on my, it's Boston ivy on my garage, not native. I planted it a long time ago before I knew any better. And then I just grow the cardinal creeper up through it, and it works pretty well. So thank you very much. And I have no way of, I don't know if I've gone over time or under time, but
Well, you're fine. You're doing great.
I said what I had to say. So I'm happy to take pictures or take questions. I mean, sorry.
Well, thank you so much. If anyone has any questions, you can go ahead and put them in the chat or in the Q&A. We'll be looking at that. I want to also let everyone know who's here that if you want to see our garden in person, we have a native garden here at the library, and we are going to be hosting poetry in the garden on Tuesday, June 21st at 3, and that's in person. So if you wanted to come check out the garden and share a poem, that would be awesome too.
Yeah, I'd be interested to know how many people who are listening already are using native plants in their gardens. Maybe people could put that in the chat. Yeah. Oh, nobody even.
Well, maybe now they'll be inspired.
Yeah, I hope I didn't make it sound too daunting.
Someone said they put in some native plants, but not really trees or bushes.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So that's, yeah, that's that.
And
And so that's something to think about. Yeah. And the other thing I will say is that when I started out, I would say I probably killed more plants than I survived. At that time, there wasn't a lot of help like there is now. And,
yeah.
I'd like to encourage everyone to check out West Cook Wild Ones, which is my organization. And let's see. Oh, I didn't put it in. I can put in the.
Oh, they want you to repeat what the vining plant in the hummingbird video was.
Oh, that's cardinal. Now, what is it? Cardinal creeper.
Cardinal creeper.
Okay. Yeah, one or the other.
Yeah, and Victor is thinking about starting a small native garden. That's wonderful.
Oh, that's great. Okay, so you can get a lot more information at westcook.wildones.org. We have monthly presentations, and we have a YouTube channel, and we have 2 native plant sales a year. We unfortunately, the spring native plant sale is closed this year. In fall, we have a native shrub and tree sale. And then we also, as I said, we have a free newsletter, and then we have free presentations. And so it's a great community for people who want to get into native plants and aren't quite sure where to start, or feeling a little nervous about it, or don't know where to buy native plants, or just want to know more.
Well, Adrian, thank you so much for coming. Thanks to everyone who came. I know it's a really nice night out today, so I'm really glad you guys came to join us on Zoom over here. Thank you so much.
All right. Well, like I always say, go forth and plant flowers.
Yes.